When arguing about the existence of race, there are three main things that people argue about. 1. The majority view. What do the experts actually think about race? 2. Heterozygosity. Is there enough variation within Homo sapiens for there to be subspecies? And 3rd, clusteredness. If so, does this variation clump up into discrete subspecies clusters? Majority view. Theoretically, we shouldn't be concerned with what the majority of experts think on a topic. We should simply be able to rely purely on our own evaluation of quote-unquote the facts. But in reality, nobody has enough time for that, and they use expert opinion on various topics as a heuristic for the correct position on that topic. And one common argument against race is that the experts recognize that race doesn't exist. The problem is that there is no such consensus. There has not been a comprehensive survey on this, but what we have found gives us a rough idea of what biologists and anthropologists believe about race. Anne Morning looked at the usage of race in 80 of the most commonly used high school biology textbooks from 1952 to 2002. While not as good as a survey of biologists, it gives us a rough indication of the trend in biology. And so we see a steep decline in the use of race, reaching a low point in the period 1983 to 1992, but an increase from 1992 to 2002, including an enormous increase in medical descriptions. In 2004, Leonard Lieberman reviewed several surveys of anthropologists in North America and Europe and found that 31% of anthropologists, physical anthropologists in North America recognized race, while 43% of physical anthropologists in Europe recognized race. In 2009, Katarzyna Kazika surveyed physical anthropologists in Eastern and Western Europe and divided the results up by age group. Kazika shows an important split between Western Europe and Eastern Europe. This is an important clue as to how, where, and why race denial emerged. In 2001, Soon and Strickalj looked at 779 articles in Acta Anthropologica Sinica, China's only anthropological journal at the time. They were able to get 74 of the 78 issues that existed from 1982 to 2001. They found in it that 324 articles dealt with human variation. They described their results. Quote, "When we applied Cartmill's approach to the Chinese sample, we found that all of the articles used the race concept and none of them questioned its value. Since these active researchers are also members of the teaching staffs at various educational institutions, it is very likely that this attitude will be transmitted to the next generation of Chinese scientists." Of course, it is possible that the views of the Chinese have changed since then, but there's no reason to think that they have. So the only place we have any evidence of a consensus on race at some point in time is in China, and it was that race exists. The best info on what quote-unquote experts believe on the existence of race comes from physical anthropologists. And all of these so far have only dealt with physical anthropologists, but what about biologists and geneticists? Well, I don't know of any recent data on biologists' views on race. However, Lieberman in 1992 looked at biology textbooks and surveyed college professors and graduates with BAs, MAs, and AAs. So first we can look at the textbooks. Here we have numbers for biology textbooks, and here we have the numbers for physical anthropology textbooks. And so the trend to race denial in the textbooks was much more pronounced in physical anthropology than it was in biology. Next, we can look at biologists and physical anthropologists with varying degrees of education. And what we see is that at all levels of education, biologists are more likely to recognize race than physical anthropologists are. At the PhD level, in 1983 to 1984, biologists were 1.46 times more likely to accept race. It's always hazardous to extrapolate too much into the future toward the present, but there's no reason to believe that biologists are all on board the race denial train today when physical anthropologists aren't even all on board today. Given that in the past, we know that biologists were always less likely to deny race than physical anthropologists were. Regarding geneticists, population or otherwise, I don't know of any scientific survey for their views on the existence of races in humans. But I do know of multiple genetics papers lamenting the return of quote-unquote the race concept in genetics. From 2006, Straw Men and Their Followers, the return of biological race. Until Armand Marie Leroy's New York Times op-ed in March 14, 2005, it is unlikely that many Americans, even among the daily readers of papers, knew that we are living in the midst of a raging debate debate over the existence of human races. The debate is occurring among and between a variety of researchers in genetics and social scientists from a range of disciplines. A number of evolutionary biologists, geneticists, biological anthropologists, and medical researchers have recently challenged the view put forth by other scientists and social scientists that race is only a social concept, not a scientific one. It's an article from 2007, Genes, Genomes, and Genealogies, The Return of Scientific Racism, from 2009, Return of the Race Myth, from 2012, The Return of Biological Race, Regulating Innovations in Race and Genetics Through Administrative Agency Race Impact Assessments, 2014, The Uncanny Return of the Race Concept. The aim of this hypothesis and theory is to question the recently increasing use of the race concept in contemporary genetic, psychiatric, neuroscience, as well as social studies. 2015, Great is Their Sin, Biological Determinism in the Age of Genomics. And there are certainly going to be many more like this. This is just what I found with a Google search going to page 2. Obviously, it would be much better to have proper surveys of various types of geneticists, but the winds seem to be blowing in the direction of race recognition. More evidence of this will be shown in cluster analyses. While the survey data and textbook data is a bit spotty and or dated, certainly dated, and for the geneticists we only have subjective analyses of trends in the field, it's enough to where we can say that this supposed consensus on race denial probably doesn't exist. Or in the case for geneticists, there's certainly no evidence of a consensus or a trend against race. The point here is not to appeal to consensus and say that race exists, but to remove this appeal to authority as a line of argument so that we can just move on to the evidence itself. And the disagreement among the experts on race is evidence of another thing. These experts probably don't spend a whole lot of time researching race or philosophizing what constitutes a race or whether or not they exist or anything. Remember, in the Chinese journal we talked about, 59% of the biological anthropology articles, which is where you would expect to be ground zero for discussion of race, 59% of those articles were not about race. For biology and general anthropology, that number of articles that are not about race is probably even higher. Heterozygosity. One popular argument used against the possibility of races in humans is that, quote, humans are 99.9% the same. This claim was made by Craig Venter in 2000. However, in 2000, Venter did another analysis that showed that only around 99.5% of human chromosomal DNA was the same between two random individuals. Despite this, it's still a popular talking point among race deniers that, quote, humans are 99.9% the same. Keep in mind that humans and chimpanzees, on the scale of genetic diversity that Craig Venter was using, are 98.7% the same, and humans are 98.4% the same as gorillas, although there are multiple ways to measure genetic diversity. Michael Woodley in 2009 published a paper entitled, Is Homo sapiens Polytypic? He compared the heterozygosity in humans to other species with wide ranges. Heterozygosity is simply the probability that at any given gene location, two organisms of that species will have a different variant or allele at that specific location. A gene is just a series of SNPs, single nucleotide proteins, so even though the similarity is 99.5% SNP by SNP, at any given gene, they can be different more often than not. In addition, this criteria doesn't measure the magnitude or phenotypic consequence of that heterozygosity, merely whether or not there is in fact a difference at any given gene location. So this is a very rough measure. So, by this measure, there appears to be enough total genetic variation in Homo sapiens for there to be subspecies within Homo sapiens. In addition, there are several recognized subspecies which have diverged from each other in time spans similar to, or even more recent than, humans have had to evolve subspecies. And given the speed at which humans have spread around the world, it shouldn't seem intuitively implausible that humans would evolve subspecies faster than most, but not all, other animals. One counter is that humans have longer generation times, and perhaps that offset the more rapid exposure to new environments that humans had. Or perhaps it didn't offset the exposure, or perhaps it only partially offset the exposure. We know that humans evolved regional differences in skin color and adult lactose tolerance, so we know for a fact that there has been some divergent evolution going on. It isn't immediately obvious or manifestly apparent that there, quote-unquote, isn't enough time for humans to form subspecies, especially since punctuated equilibrium, pioneered by our good friend Stephen Jay Gould, and and introgression provide mechanisms for fast evolution. Genetic clusteredness. FST is the proportion of total variation that exists between two populations compared to the overall variation in both populations. FST distances between the subspecies of various species are similar to the distance between human populations when the number of human populations is set to either 14 or 44. FST values will vary depending on how many groups you divide a species into. The FST value for each species is just an average for all subspecies relations. K equals 14 refers to the number of subdivisions within the species. The fewer the divisions that are recognized, the higher the average FST value between the divisions is going to be. That's why any species will have a higher FST value when the number of recognized populations is lower, ceteris paribus, all else being equal. Another thing we can look at is how self-identification corresponds to best fit genetic cluster. Cluster analyses are where researchers get a bunch of genetic data and then tell the computer to sort it into clusters. For example, it may take 300 locations at the genome and then tell the computer to sort these individuals based on those 300 pieces of DNA into 5 clusters. The computer can sort it into however many clusters you tell it to. So say there are 5 recognized races in an area. Socially recognized races. What researchers will do is take some genetic markers, give it to a computer, and tell the computer to just sort it into 5 categories and see how well those 5 categories correspond to these socially recognized races. This was seen in BAMSHAD way back in 2003, where they found the correspondence between genetic cluster and geography by the number of loci used. And you can see with 160 loci used, the correspondence was higher. These are the results when K equals 3, or the number of populations the computer is told to classify the data into is 3. The computer doesn't know beforehand the race of the individuals. It just gets a whole bunch of data and then is told to cluster them in so many number of groups. BAMSHAD also looked at the correspondence between geography and cluster when the number of groups is 2 and 4. This also deals with another criticism of race, that the categories are subjective. This is sort of true in the same way that we can say that the lines between colors are subjective, where red ends and orange begins is a subjective thing. So are we going to use this subjectivity of boundaries to say that colors don't exist? In addition, the boundaries seem to only go in one dimension. You don't have, for example, a racial category where Japanese and Kenyans are of the same cluster, whereas Chinese are then over in this other cluster. This picture here provides a visual description of how well the races correspond to geography based on the number of loci used in the categorization. And you can see there's much tighter clustering when you use 100 ALU insertions versus 20 ALU insertions. Now, if you were a researcher and you were dishonest and you wanted to claim that race doesn't exist, which triangle would you point to? You would point to the one with the fewest loci. You would point to the 20 insertions. This is often done in courses on race, where the teacher gives the class a genetic test to see what race they are or what their admixture is. And these tests use a very small number of SNPs, around 20. And the fewer SNPs you use, the less clustered it's going to be. The genetic cluster that these genetic tests find will correspond to the visibly recognized races. We know this as an empirical fact. And so a dishonest and uninformed teacher will do this. And so you'll end up with a red-haired, freckled-faced white girl thinking that she's more genetically similar to black people than she is to white people because some either stupid or dishonest professor gave her a genetic ancestry test that only looked at 20 loci. In 2007, Dominique Aloco looked at random locations of SNPs and found that even if you use random SNPs, you still get very good correspondence between self-identification and best fit genetic cluster. Using as few as 100 randomly selected SNPs, they found a roughly 97% correspondence between self-reported ancestry and best fit genetic cluster. In addition, they found that coding and non-coding DNA had almost identical clusteredness, which is evidence against the argument that the races differ primarily on non-coding DNA due to genetic drift and differ less on coding DNA due to stabilizing selection. A paper by Lau in 2010 looked not at SNPs, but at short tandem repeats and basically measured the variation in the number of times a known DNA sequence repeated itself at various sites. In this case, they looked at 24 different sites and compared self-reported ancestry with where they fit into short tandem repeat clusters. This is a different method from the other studies, but it yields very similar results. Guo in 2015 is the most recent cluster analysis that compared self-identified race with best fit cluster. The Room study used 384 1,024 SNPs, and the ADD Health study used 1,536 SNPs. In the GUO study, whites in the US matched the white genetic cluster 99.4% and 99.5% of the time. Blacks matched the black cluster 99.3% and 100% of the time, and the East Asians matched the non-South Asian 97.7% and 93.71% of the time. More studies that replicate BAMSHAD and GUO are Rosenberg 2005, Risch 2005, Witherspoon 2007, and Porras Hurtado 2013. The history of race denial. As seen above, race denial appears to have come about following World War II. The concluding statements of a Moscow conference in 1998 on race entitled Race, Myth or Reality included this line, quote, 1. According to the old anthropological tradition, big human variations, which are the result of polymorphism united by common origin in certain geographical areas, have been given the name races. 2. Reality of the racial subdivisions of Homo sapiens are supported by the totality of the scientific data investigated on the different levels of human organism: morphological, physiological, and genetical. Racial classification created with regard to morphological criteria clearly enough reflect the phylogeny of the separate populations and groups of populations. 3. Negativism to the race concept, which became apparent during the last decades, in many respects might be explained by the psychological shock which all progressive humanity had felt in the epoch of Hitlerism. While certainly more polite, these kinds of conclusions about race denial could have come straight off of a Stormfront.org message board. The survey data, as limited as it is, paints a picture of what happened. Following World War II, there was an academic movement to deny race. This began with the post-war popularization of the 1942 book by Ashley Montagu entitled Man's Most Dangerous Myth, The Fallacy of Race, and then the UN 1951 Statement on Race. This movement peaked somewhere between 1980 and 1990 and has since started to recede, but with the internet has come a curious theme. The race denial movement, though receding in the universities, is gaining ground in public discourse, or at least seemed to be gaining ground 2 years ago when I initially wrote this article, as I actually wrote this article on another site long before it was posted on the alternativehypothesis.org. Demanding a hard definition. One tactic of race denial is to get really hard up on some super explicit definition of race. Races are obviously just populations of people geographically separate that interbred with each other and thus are genetically and physically distinguishable. That's obviously true and all you need, and we should just be able to go forward and talk about the genetic differences between these races. But the hard definition demander will demand some specific parameters for the sole purpose of deconstructing race, in the hopes that the race recognizer will not have the information on these parameters that he supposedly needs to show that races exist. Or he will pre-select conditions that he knows in advance that humans don't meet. For example, an FST distance of 0.2 or an inability to interbreed. And it starts to get absurd when you point to specific alleles that correspond to variation in melanin, for example, and how these alleles vary between the races, because they will literally be at the point of saying that we cannot say that, quote, black people have black skin because black people is not a scientific category. Of course, it's perfectly scientific. We can point them out, their geographic ancestry, it corresponds to cluster groups using specific markers or random SNPs if you want. And none of these games are ever done for any other subspecies or haplogroup of any other species. It is only with human subspecies, or breeds if you want to call them, that we get this bizarre radical skepticism. Conclusion. So, first off, there is no obvious consensus on the existence of race, so we cannot use consensus as a heuristic one way or another. Second off, there is definitely enough genetic variation within Homo sapiens to have subspecies. Third off, this genetic variation clusters into discrete groups, and to the extent FST is a measure of clusteredness, this can be seen in FST values and in cluster analyses. And the cluster analyses include short tandem repeat analyses, single nucleotide protein analyses, including ones which use random SNPs, and it works just as well with coding and non-coding DNA. Fourth off, we can trace race denial to a reaction to the Nazis primarily in Western Europe and to a lesser extent in Eastern Europe, which peaked from 1980 to 1990 and is now declining among the experts, if not necessarily among the public. Though 2 years on after writing this article, I get a sense that race denial is declining among the public as well.